I'm sorry about the delay there. I think what happened was that my computer needed to apply some flash updates, as happens from time to time. So last week I had intended to cover both radio and television, and as you know, we only got through radio, and I'm recalling from previous lectures, I tend to take longer on radio and television. They're more dense chapters. So I expect today I'll just cover television, and then we'll catch up in coming weeks. So. There we are. Okay. I hope everybody's doing well today. So, as I said, I like to cover radio and television together because they're very closely related in terms of technological patterns and development. Of course, they're both broadcast technologies. The issues related to regulation have a significant amount of overlap between radio and television, particularly issues related to use of broadcast spectrum, but also issues related to regulation of content and things of that nature. So, television emerged. Television was developing at the same time as radio. Early television was, but it didn't emerge as a viable communications technology until radio had already been relatively well established. So the patterns that existed for radio in North America served as the existing model for organizing broadcasting. So in other words, where early radio, and if you'll remember, I talked about early radio and the competition between hobbyists and independent inventors and innovators on the one hand, and government and big business on the other hand. And that in the development of early radio, it was unclear at the beginning what balance would exist among those interests. By the time television emerged as a viable medium, in the United States, the model of broadcasting as a commercial medium that carved out small spaces for non-commercial purposes was well established, and that was the dominant, and that model was followed with television. So keep that in mind as we proceed. A few of the technological innovations. Now, remember, we are looking at, in each of the cases that we're looking at technological innovations. In other words, the things that inventors, innovators were figuring out how to do become pieces that make possible the technologies that develop and turn into larger communication systems. So the cathode ray tube, which was essential to the development of early television, was developed in the 1800s by German inventor Karl Ferdinand Braun. Now, again, we're also looking at the innovations behind technologies, and with all the technologies we're looking at, the innovations are international, but the industries that develop become dominated, in the cases we're looking at, dominated by the United States. That's shifting somewhat now, but in the period that broadcasting was developing, the United States, with its economic dominance, was able to set standard for development that had international impacts. Also in the 1890s, Paul Nipkow was an inventor. He was working to put together a mechanical scanner system. In other words, the cathode ray tube was able to generate light, but without the ability to move the tube around, to have a motion in the image. That didn't work. That couldn't become something that would develop a motion picture broadcast system. So the mechanical scanner was also a very important development. Television, for some time, television, and this has changed with high definition television, but television for many years used a scanning system in which light was transmitted vertically and horizontally across the screen very quickly to create images on the screen. And this mechanical scanner system was an innovation that helped develop that model. By 1907, Boris Rosing, another inventor, had taken these two technologies and put them together. In other words, take a cathode ray tube, put it on a scanner, and you can create a picture that moves. John Logie Baird, by 1926, had developed a mechanical television that was functional but not economically viable. But by 1932, he had developed what became the first commercially viable TV system. So 1930s, people had put together these innovations and come up with broadcast a television that was actually potentially commercially viable. A big name in television history, Philo Farnsworth. He is the person credited with transmitting the very first electronically scanned television signal in 1927. This development, people took this development and worked on it and were able to improve the picture quality of electronic signals. This was something that helped to push out mechanical scanning. Now, as I said, mechanical scanners, the ones that actually move an object across the screen, that was the very first, the earliest innovation. The later innovation was electronic scanning that didn't actually require a mechanical object moving across the screen. In the United States, the Federal Radio Commission authorized the very first experimental television stations. This was from 1928 to the 1930s. Radio already existed at this point as an established was already in place as an established medium, still an early medium, but established medium at this point. So we didn't have, with television, we didn't have the sort of the chaotic moments of no regulation and lots of interference with signals. So as television was developing, there was already in place a system to regulate the broadcast spectrum. And in 1939, NBC, the National Broadcasting Corporation, big radio network, you'll recall, launched the very first television station with regular programming. Now, one of the things that the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, you'll recall the FCC is the regulatory body that replaced the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. One of the things that the FCC was supposed to do, now besides regulating the broadcast environment to ensure that there wasn't interference, that someone who had an existing licensed station would not suffer interference from someone else. Another thing that the FCC was charged with doing was actually to put regulations in place that would help make developing communication systems commercially viable. And one of these things was to ensure that there were common standards. It became clear very early on with television that if different companies were developing televisions that worked in different ways, that it would be very difficult to develop a common system that consumers could trust. If consumers were not able to get reliably receive signals on their television sets, they wouldn't go out and buy sets. If advertisers couldn't be confident that a large number of consumers could see their programming, then they wouldn't buy advertising. And there are many other issues involved with this that had commercial implications. So essentially, picture it this way. If you have 5 broadcasters in an area, and they're all working with different standards for broadcasting, then you've got a situation where people have to buy a different set, a different television set for each signal they want to capture. It's an unmanageable situation. So what the FCC was doing was putting in place technical standards, rules for broadcast signals and for receivers that would ensure that when I buy a television set, I can receive any signal that's available in my area. Okay. World War II came about the United States entered the war in the 1940s. Of course, the war began in the 1930s. But World War II kind of stalled the development of broadcasting and broadcasting sets as research and development went into the war effort. So similar to what happened during the First World War with radio and stalling the development of radio and the development of radio as a commercial medium. World War II stalled the development of television for several years. Another interesting thing, color technology. Color technology was a relatively early innovation. They were first conceived in 1904, first demonstrated in 1928. The first FCC-approved color television was put on the market in 1953. In 1954, the very first color broadcast, commercial broadcast, was made. But black and white television dominated the industry until the early 1970s. Now, I think a lot of this had to do with the cost of color televisions, with people who had bought televisions, black and white televisions, not wanting to replace them because it would be expensive to replace them, so on. I grew up during this era, and I remember the debate that went on in my family over color television. I remember walking down, my family had a black and white television until probably 1980, well after color television became dominant. You could still receive, with a black and white television, you could still receive the signals broadcast in color. You just wouldn't see them in color. And I remember walking down the streets in my neighborhood at night and seeing the houses where people had color television, which was really struck me as a very well, it made me feel kind of left out, actually, because my family didn't have a color television. Now, this is not always an economic issue. Lots of people preferred black and white television, and this was the case in my family. My parents had seen color television, and they didn't like it. They liked black and white, and that's why we kept black and white television for so many years. We talk about the golden age of television. Now, you remember we had talked last week about the golden age of radio, the 1930s to 1950, when radio was the dominant medium in the United States. The golden age of television is considered 1950 to around 1970. This is a period when television was first developing. It was a big innovation, and you see from this graphic, in 1950, when commercial television was still in its infancy, 10% of households in the United States owned a television set. By 1955, this has gone up almost to 65%, just in 5 years. It's a huge leap. 1960, 87% of households own a TV, and 1965, 92.6%. So there was a huge leap during this era in household ownership of televisions. This is when you think about it, we talk now about how amazing the growth of the internet has been, and the expansion of the number of homes that have computers, internet access, all this sort of thing. Well, it's actually, that is impressive, but it's no more impressive than the growth that took place in this age with television. So I think it's a very, very important to keep that context in mind. Television programming and formats. Initially, television borrowed very heavily from radio. You remember last week we talked about some of the different formats in radio: comedy programs, Man on the Street, talk show, and so on. Not only did television borrow the formats, television went so far as to recruit people recruit people who were producing programming for radio and have them produce the very same programming for television. So many of the early television programs actually started as radio programs. Some of them coexisted for a period of time, both on radio and on television, and then later on made the full transition to television as television became the dominant entertainment medium. Early television, like early radio, there was a dominance of programs that had single sponsors. When we watch television today, commercial television supported by advertising, usually what we see is programming where there are many ads from different sponsors throughout the television program. That isn't the way it worked with early television. With early television, like early radio, oftentimes a single sponsor would sponsor and sometimes actually have complete control over producing a program, which gave sponsors an enormous amount of control over the content of a program. Another thing that happened was development of longer sort of magazine format programs. We had programs called Today, The Tonight Show. The Tonight Show lasted for years and years and years. These were longer format programming that required more advertising money, and these started to appeal to a breadth of advertisers. A single sponsor may not want to pay for a program that was 2 hours long. It would just be too expensive, and this helped to promote what we call spot advertisements. These advertisements that would be bought separately, individually by different sponsors. It doesn't remove the control of advertisers, but when you have, say, when you have a program that has 15 different advertisers buying advertising space, it makes it harder for any single advertiser to exert control over the content. It put more control over television content in the hands of television stations, television producers. Another very popular format that developed in television was the quiz show. And there are many examples of programs where people would come on television, and we would create develop sort of a relationship with people. There's a very famous movie actor, Groucho Marx, who was a comedian, led a troupe of performers called the Marx Brothers, and he had a very famous quiz show that ran for years and years. So. In the 1960s and 1970s, television, similar to the way that we developed with radio, AM and FM bands, and the AM band and the FM band have different qualities. Remember, the AM band is one that allows the signal to be bounced off the atmosphere. The signal can travel long distances. It's not a very high quality signal, but it's a signal that can be transmitted great distances effectively. The FM band is one that requires a direct transmission, but it has the potential to deliver much more high quality signals, even though it's over shorter distances. There's a similar development with television between VHF and UHF stations. And I apologize at the moment, I don't remember what VHF and UHF stand for. VHF stations were the higher quality, usually higher quality signals, and those were usually dominated by large network stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, sometimes public station affiliates would occupy those channels. Those would be higher quality signals, and they were the lower numbers on the dial, 2 through 13. Then UHF signals. UHF signals were they could be transmitted somewhat further distances than the VHF channels, but again the quality was much lower, and those were usually occupied by local television stations in the 60s and 70s that may not be affiliated with a larger network. Usually there were fewer than 10 in any community. Usually there would be fewer than 10 total stations available. This is in any medium-sized metropolitan area. It would depend, this would depend on a number of factors. Television, even more so than radio, television was susceptible to interference. So mountainous areas were oftentimes very bad for television reception. Areas that were sparsely populated were oftentimes very bad for television. People that lived in those areas would have fewer channels. I grew up in suburban Boston, and Boston is a medium-sized, what we call a medium-sized, medium market city in the United States. And when I was growing up, we had about 10 television stations that we could receive. Now, one of the interesting things about television broadcasting is if you actually got into a large city, this was not necessarily good for your television reception, because being in an area with tall buildings can interfere with reception. So people in large cities had to rely on antennas, sort of sophisticated antenna systems to help them improve their television reception. I remember when I was growing up how I was always surprised if we would visit people in either in Boston itself, or even more so, we had some friends we visited in New York City, and I was always surprised when I was growing up because I'd go to New York City, a huge city, and the friends we visited had less access to television than I did because of broadcast interference. So. About 15 years ago, I was a teaching assistant in a university in Canada, and I remember talking to some of the students about the early broadcast, not even early broadcast, the broadcast model, and how, basically you bought a television, made sure it had an antenna, you turned it on, and boom, you had television. And a few of the students had kind of puzzled looks on their faces. And one of them looked at me and said, "You mean television used to be free?" This was a little bit of a shock to me at the time. It no longer is, but young people now have grown up in a situation where many of them haven't actually experienced broadcast television. They've only experienced cable television. or television over the internet, which is a very different thing. And they don't have a concept of the broadcast model and television signals being available to people without actually paying someone to receive the signal. That's the dominant model in broadcasting in the United States. There's a signal transmitted freely without additional charge. This is different in some other places. For example, in Britain, the model that was developed in Britain was one where there was essentially a tax placed on people based on the number of television receivers they had, and there was a sophisticated system of people going around figuring out who had television sets and whether they were paying into the system or not. Okay, so with television, as with radio, broadcast spectrum, the space in which signals can be transmitted, is limited. And actually the space is more limited with television than it is with radio. The signals require more space, more spectrum, and so that's one reason that the number of television stations in any particular area is usually significantly smaller than the number of radio stations. Another reason, of course, is that radio signals can be transmitted further, so and radio broadcasting is cheaper, so it's more economically viable to have more radio signals covering particular areas. Okay, so the innovation of cable television. Cable television first developed, it was actually quite early. It developed before the golden age of television. It was called community antenna television, and developed in areas, it developed as a solution for areas where there was very poor reception. So places where there were lots of mountains, lots of buildings, or communities that were very distant from metropolitan centers, oftentimes became places where it made sense to have a community antenna television system. Now, essentially what community antenna television system means is you have one reception point instead of many reception points. That reception point captures signals, and the signals are transmitted within a smaller community through a system of cables. In the 1950s, cable operators began experimenting with bringing in signals from distant cities. In other words, people in an area may be interested in seeing broadcasts from other places, and if a cable system could bring in these signals and make them available to people, then the system itself becomes more valuable, worth more to the people in the community. So the technology for cable was in place for quite some time, but cable television didn't become a strong competitor with broadcast television until around the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s. This was because of deregulation in this era. The government started to take the position that in this period that one of the key reasons that government saw for regulating both the use of spectrum signals and the content that was passing through the spectrum for broadcasting. A key reason that they believed there was authority to do this was that the spectrum was seen as a public good, as a resource that didn't belong to any particular person, but belonged to the community as a whole. So if broadcasters were allowed to use this public resource for their commercial purposes, then government had the authority to step in and regulate the use of that resource. This was the underlying logic of much of broadcasting regulation into the 1980s. As the movement for deregulation grew in the United States, and this was not just in the broadcasting area, but in all areas of government, people came to see cable broadcasting, cable casting, as something different from over-the-air broadcasting. In other words, cable systems were systems where there was a system of wires that cable systems used to deliver their signals. And the cable casters themselves were responsible for laying this wire. And the signals were not generally accessible to people other than subscribers of the system, other than people who paid to get that signal. So the logic of deregulating, in other words, of saying, okay, government steps back and it will exert less pressure over what you present on your system than we do in a broadcast environment. The logic for that was, this is a privately managed system. It's a system that people aren't required to buy into, that's voluntary. And the people, if they don't choose to use that system, they still have access to a broadcast system that is regulated, more regulated by the government. So deregulation in cable helped generate some interest. Deregulation meant that cable television could start putting programming on the air that you may not see on broadcast television. It may go a little bit over the edge. Now, and I'm realizing I haven't explained some of what's regulated, or what had traditionally been regulated in the broadcasting sphere. In one of the things that the government does in regulating broadcasting content is it sets rules for what kinds of things you can say. It sets limits on things like indecency, nudity, sometimes would constrain programming that's inappropriate for children. You can only have it in certain hours, things like this. So that's the kind of control that was exerted over broadcasting, and is still exerted to some extent, although the laws have loosened in recent years. When cable was deregulated, one thing that was deregulated was the content of cable, so that the rules regarding what could go on cable television were much looser than the rules regarding what could go on broadcast television. This created some controversy, but it also helped spur interest in cable television. Cable systems were also able to carry more channels than broadcast systems made available. So even early cable television could could handle 40, 50 stations at a time, and that was far more than most people could get through broadcast television. And so this was another reason that interest in cable television was spurred and helped promote the growth of cable in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Another more recent innovation is digital television. Digital television, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the term digitization, the conversion of information into binary code, into computer readable code. Some of the advantages of digital transmission are that signals become more compact, smaller, so that more signals can be broadcast in the same amount of spectrum space. When there's a proper connection, there's a superior quality of a digital signal to analog. It can carry much more information. It opens up the opportunity for higher quality television picture, higher quality sound, more different channels of information in the same spectrum space. A disadvantage of a digital signal is that where with an analog signal, the old style of broadcasting, if you get farther and farther away from the signal source, or if you're in a place where there's interference, oftentimes you can still see the signal, even if it's bad quality. With digital television, you either get the signal or you don't. In other words, if there's some interference with the signal, you lose the entire signal. I experienced this year. It was very frustrating. Last year I was living in Toronto, and I was playing around with a digital television trying to get broadcast signals, and it was very frustrating because in that Toronto's a big city, lots of buildings, and I was just working with in the apartment antenna, and I could only ever get the television signals at certain times of day, because if there was the slightest interference, the whole signal would go out. So, there's been international adoption of digital television. 2015 was the year that was set internationally for conversion of analog signals to digital signals. Now, if any of you are aware of this transition, I'm not sure at what point it happened in Korea. In Kazakhstan, where we are here in Kazakhstan, it happened just in 2014, 2015 was the period of transition finally to digital. The introduction of digital signals required everybody who was receiving television either to buy a new television set or to buy a conversion box that could capture a digital signal and convert it into an analog signal for an older style television. So it was a fairly controversial, fairly expensive process. It was even more expensive for broadcasters themselves. And one of the somewhat invisible, when I say invisible, I mean you have to pay lots of attention to notice this, but one of the things that happened with the conversion from analog to digital signals in many areas was that, and Kazakhstan as an example, in that transition, on the broadcasting side, lots of smaller broadcasters were pushed out of broadcasting, and in many places, the shift to a digital environment was used to kind of reduce the number of small players in the market. So larger players, larger broadcasters captured a bigger portion of the market. In Kazakhstan, where government controls the broadcast system directly regulates the government actually owns the key broadcasting structures, and private broadcasters use that infrastructure. So here in Kazakhstan, the number of small broadcasters in the digital environment was reduced. Although part of the logic of the digital environment is you can have more channels, more of this, more of that. Yes, that's true, but the way that it was regulated actually reduced the number of players in the broadcasting arena. The shift to digital television meant that now essentially the way it worked was broadcasters were told, they had a period of time, and they were told in this number of years you're going to have to shift your broadcasting system from an analog system that uses one spectrum arena to a digital signal that uses another spectrum. There was a transition period during which broadcasts happened in both signals. In other words, for a few years, broadcasters would have an analog signal, which standard televisions would receive, and a digital signal, which the new televisions that people were buying would receive those signals. And then the analog signal was phased out, and the analog signal, in the United States a public resource, was then auctioned off for other purposes. In other words, this previously public resource was privatized, sold off to companies that were using that spectrum for purposes other than broadcasting. And mobile phone providers were one of the huge markets for this. There were also sections of the spectrum that went to the military and that sort of thing. So this was quite controversial in the United States among people who follow things like broadcast regulation, but I think the general public was only minimally aware of it. So this has been a shift in how spectrum is managed that has resulted in what was formerly a public resource being sold off and put into private hands, gone. So okay, so we see in this chart, this chart tracks the number of hours that viewers are watching television over years, and already in 1950, very early in television, the average television viewer is watching more than 4 hours of television in a day. But that number keeps going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, with a couple of dips here and there. But generally the trend is for people to watch television for greater periods of the day. And this went sort of hand in hand, as you recall from the chart we looked at a few minutes ago, the period of 1950 to 1970, the golden age of television, also shows more and more households owning televisions. So this chart here refers to the people who own televisions and how much television they're watching in a given day, the number of hours. The chart we looked at before was the number of households that have TV. So if you keep that in mind, consider a society where more and more people are watching more and more television. This is the dynamic that has persisted with television. So television has a strong cultural impact, and part of that impact has to do with the number of people who are exposed to television and with the amount of time they're exposed to television. And these two charts together illustrate some of that for us. Now, it's interesting to consider the culture in which television was emerging in the United States. In the U.S. in the 1950s, it was just after World War II. The Soviet Union emerged from, two big things happened. I think two big changes in the world that are worth pointing out here. The United States emerged as the dominant Western power at the end of World War I, and the Soviet Union emerged as the other dominant power. The Soviet Union, even during World War II, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were considered allies, were fighting together against Nazi Germany. Even at that point, there was a good deal of feeling of anti-communism in the United States, and worry that the Soviet Union represented a system that was fundamentally at odds with the system in place in the United States. So in U.S. culture in the 1950s, post-World War II, there was rising prosperity. As the dominant Western power, the United States had suffered relatively little from the impact of the war. The war did not happen in U.S. territory, except for the initial Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into the war, and the United States benefited tremendously from the sales of military equipment during the war. So the war itself for the United States turned out to be an economic boom. So there was rising prosperity in the United States after World War II. There was expansion, development of suburbs. So where previously there had been a very strong division in the United States between rural areas where agriculture was dominant and urban areas where you'd find manufacturing and information industries and those sorts of things. In the 1950s, with rising prosperity, the ability of people to buy homes, to buy cars, this sort of thing, there was an expansion that meant there was a rise of suburbs, areas outside of cities where people lived and then they commuted into work, that sort of thing. Anti-communism in politics, anti-communism was very prominent during this era. There was lots of anti-communist sentiment in the United States. There were people who were seen as leftist communist sympathizers, often had their careers ruined during this era. The Korean War sure I don't have to tell you about. I'll tell you just about the U.S. perception of the Korean War. The Korean War was for the U.S. was something far away, but very much important because of the tension between communist and non-communist societies, and so that was a very significant element of cultural life in the 1950s in the United States. I spoke about previously about television program and the transition from radio to television. Early television programming kind of pirated from radio programming. They were already very popular now up to the 1950s. The 1930s to the 1950s was the golden age of radio. Families had strong relationships at this point to the programming that they heard on the radio, and it made perfect sense for television broadcasters, and many of the television broadcasters were the very same companies that owned the radio broadcasts. So it made perfect sense for television broadcasting to take the themes, the genres, the concepts, even the actual programming, the stars and the programs themselves, and convert them into a format that could be shown on television. Dramas, comedies, westerns were all very popular on radio, and they became the thing that helped television grow. In many of the shows, there was a focus on suburban and urban families that sort of matched some of the cultural changes that were happening in the United States. And as I mentioned, the development of quiz shows was very important in early television programming. So some of the kinds of programs that were popular, and these were all programs that had started on radio. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie was an entertainment program that the person you see here is a puppeteer, and she was bringing puppeteering. It was a very popular show, particularly for children. Baby Snooks was a comedy show. Now you see the big microphone here. Early television, some programs would show somebody with a big microphone, and it's sort of an acknowledgement of the existence of that program in radio. Dotto was an early game show. Down in the left-hand corner, you see, this is actually a color photo a little bit later in television, but this is Ken may correct me if I'm remembering incorrectly. I think this program was Rawhide, although there were many different Western programs that had started on radio and turned to television. And last of all, the program Father Knows Best. Early radio and early television are, in lots of ways, were very conservative media, and Father Knows Best was a program started on radio, continued on television, that presented a very kind of conservative image of the American family, where a father is the center of the family, the person who earns money and who is the authority, the person everybody turns to know what's right, what should we do, that sort of thing. So this was a very dominant theme in early television programming. There was a shift in the 1960s in the United States culturally, and this shift you can see in in many ways in television programming. U.S. culture in the 1960s, there were a lot of, and this is an incomplete list. 1957, I believe, the Soviet Union was the first country to successfully launch a satellite into outer space. This was Sputnik. And this provoked a very strong reaction in the United States, and a focus on what became known as the space race, with the idea that of different achievements being the marks of who is winning the race, launching satellites, sending people into space, trips to the moon, all these sorts of things were part of that. There was also a continuing Cold War, and I'm sorry, I don't know if I used the phrase Cold War when we talked about the 1950s, but it's a very important phrase to remember in terms of the United States and its international relationships. Cold War is a state of constant tension between countries of the West, the United States, Britain, so on, and the Soviet sphere. And this was a state that began right after World War II and continued right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. The Vietnam War, now the United States entered the Vietnam War in the early 1960s, entering the war as a replacement for France. The Vietnam War, of course, was another theater of war that was a part of the Cold War. When the Soviets and the Western forces confronted one another during the Cold War, they didn't do so directly. They always did so through wars in countries that were backed by one side or the other. And of course, Vietnam was a major issue for the United States. As the Vietnam War developed in the United States, there was growing opposition to the war, particularly among university-age students. There was resistance to draft, to serving in the war, and resistance to the policies of the war. And this was something that had a big impact culturally in the United States. There was also a growing women's movement in this time, increased focus on women's rights. There was student unrest in general. Much of the student unrest had to do with issues like the Vietnam War, civil rights, women's movement, and universities became the site of protests. And there was a development of a youth culture that developing around music, rock and roll, the kind of loosened sexual morals, and increased visible usage of drugs. So these are all things. Now, I'm not trying to give you a clear picture of each of these things. I'm just trying to signal things that were going on in the U.S. at this point that are significant if we want to have a context for understanding the development of television. As television programming developed, of course, there were some shows that don't necessarily have clear connections to these cultural changes. There were lots of programs that focused on animals. Lassie, about a dog. Flipper about a dolphin, Gentle Ben was about a bear. These were shows that were generally aimed at kids and families, entertainment programming. Western dramas and comedies continued to be central in 1960s television. There was a development of what we call space dramas. One show, now probably the more culturally significant program was Star Trek. Star Trek was a drama that was designed to be like a Western in outer space. But Star Trek oftentimes did what we call pushing the envelope. It addressed cultural issues that were prevalent in the United States in ways that other programs weren't. Now, science fiction, this show was a science fiction show, as was the other Lost in Space. Science fiction can oftentimes address issues that are a bit more controversial because it allows us some bit of distance from what we're looking at. So Star Trek, among other things, Star Trek was the very first program that had a scene with an interracial kiss. It was the very first broadcast television program with an interracial kiss. It had a multinational cast. The crew of the spaceship, the Enterprise, that was central to the story was made up of some people who were clearly American, or there was a Scottish engineer. There was a black woman who had a name that sounded like an African name. In the cast, a Japanese man, a Russian man. So it was a multicultural cast at a time when there was very little in television in the United States. There was very, very little even presence of people who weren't white on television in the United States. Never mind mixed cultural group in a television program. So this was a way that this one particular show was kind of pushing the envelope on civil rights issues that were prevalent in the United States. Lost in Space was culturally much less interesting. It was aimed at children, but another space drama. And there was a space comedy called My Favorite Martian, which interesting simply for the fact that it shows the combination of programs shows an interest, that the cultural interest in space in the United States, which was spurred by the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, was working its way culturally into television. There was also a comedy at this point. Now, a comedy at this point called Hogan's Heroes. It was a comedy based on a prisoner of war camp in World War II. World War II in this period was still part of the popular imagination. My parents at this point were in their 20s, and they were born during World War II. They remembered elements of World War II, and there were still lots of people around with a strong memory of World War II. Youth culture, developing youth culture was part of television programming at this point. There were shows that were aimed at capturing the youth market. There was a drama, a police drama called The Mod Squad, in which some kind of hip countercultural kids joined the police and started working to combat drug trafficking and things of this nature. The Monkees was a television show about a music group that was roughly modeled on some of the music groups that were part of the British invasion at this point. The incoming influx of British rock acts that were very popular in music at this time. And then there was a show, a variety show that was headlined by a husband and wife who were part of a musical team, Sonny and Cher. So these were all things. Now, these programs represent a big shift for television in terms of what was shown on television, and they fit into the big cultural changes that were going on in the United States in the 1960s. The 1960s was a time of a great deal of cultural stress, and the programming that emerged on television was reflecting some of that. And you see here, now here's the cast of Star Trek. You see here in the back, you can see Lieutenant Uhura, who's the African American woman. Yellow shirt on the far, on the second from the left is Ensign Chekhov, who was the Russian character. There's even an alien, Commander Spock, as part of this. So Star Trek was really pushing multiculturalism in an era when multiculturalism was not popular. It was just emerging at this point. So Star Trek was very much pushing cultural issues in television that were not prevalent at this time. Game shows, of course, Let's Make a Deal was another game show, so standards were continuing. Lost in Space, another one of the space shows. Lassie. Batman. Batman, on the previous slide, I didn't mention it, but on the previous slide, there was a program in the 1960s called Batman that was based on the comic book Batman. I'm sure you're all familiar, if not with the comic books, then with the Batman movies that have come out over the years. This show was interesting because it used a lot of interesting graphics that were becoming more common in the 1960s. It did a lot of using humor that could be understood in different ways. They also used a lot of different figures from different cultural episodes in the United States, which is a little hard to explain, but this was, and it was a program that simultaneously appealed to children and to adults. It appealed to children kind of through its cartoonish character and superheroes, that sort of thing. But the humor was a humor that could be appreciated by children on one level and by adults in a whole different level. So this was one of those programs. When I was growing up, I remember families would gather together. My family, we had friends, and we would all gather together, and the kids, I was probably 5 years old when the show was out, and all the kids would kind of gather around and run around pretending to be Batman and Robin, and the adults would sit around and laugh at the jokes. So it was something that was kind of trying to appeal simultaneously to a broad range of demographics in the U.S. The television, now you remember from last week we talked about radio as being a medium that was used by politicians to reach broader audiences. Politics, of course, moved to television in the 1950s and especially the 1960s. And what we see in the corner here is a photo of John F. Kennedy, who was president in the early 1960s. I believe he entered office in, or he was elected in 1960, assassinated in 1964. But he was the first president whose election victory was attributed to his skillful use of television and his the image that he projected on television. He was good looking, articulate, appealed to people, and used television very effectively to reach people. So that oftentimes Kennedy is pointed to as an example of the very first president who was able to use television to greatly increase his influence and his appeal to audiences. In the 1970s, in U.S. culture, there was continuing opposition to the Vietnam War, and the opposition really reached a head in the late 1960s and continued until the early 1970s, when finally the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam. And this was a very controversial period in U.S. history, essentially the U.S. Admitting defeat in Vietnam. The Watergate scandal, this was a scandal which involved President Richard Nixon, who had been involved in covering up a robbery that was intended to gather information that would from the opposition party that would help Nixon achieve re-election. This was a scandal that resulted in Nixon's resignation from the presidency, and was another very controversial, painful period in U.S. history. The 1970s saw economic downturn. The 1950s, 1960s was growth. In the 1970s, economically, there was inflation, jobs suffered, and it was a period of economic downturn. Sexual liberation continued. Birth control had developed to a point that there was much less, let's say sexual activity. People could engage in sex without nearly as much worry about pregnancy, and so sexuality was expressed much more openly and broadly. The women's movement developed. The environmental movement developed. 1970s television, situation comedies continued, were relatively dominant. Police and detective shows were very prominent. Social issues in this era on television often reflected the social issues, cultural issues that were at the forefront in the United States. So if we look at some of the programming, and you can see how, if I'm showing you these publicity photos from various television programs, There was a program called All in the Family that emerged in the 1970s, and it was a situation comedy, but it was a situation comedy that set up a conservative working class man, Archie Bunker, and his wife, who was presented as a sort of a what we call ditzy, not very smart woman, against his daughter, who was presented as sort of a countercultural youth sort of hippie girl, and her husband. And the situation that was set up was a constant conflict within the family over social issues like issues of race and racism, issues of labor issues, anti-communism, all these kinds of cultural tensions were shown on the program as tensions within this family. So this was actually some very interesting television in this era, because the program itself was highlighting many of the conflicts that were present in the United States at this time. It was a very, kind of in that way, a very risky program. MASH, the middle picture on the top, MASH was based on a series of novels that were written about, and it's set in the Korean War, and featured medical. It was a military medical unit operating during the Korean War. And again, this program, now in some ways it was interesting simply for the fact of depicting a war that, although nobody said the United States lost this war, the United States did, or at least the side, neither did they win it. From the U.S. perspective, it resulted in a stalemate. And so that's a certain amount of controversy, but there are things that come up in this program that, similar to All in the Family, suggested some of the cultural tensions that were in play during this era, including things like conflict over whether to give medical treatment to enemy soldiers, and very prominently dealt with the relationship of soldiers to authority. So other programs here, Charlie's Angels in the lower right-hand screen. It was a police program, but it really prominently highlighted the beautiful, beautiful women, showing sexuality of some level in television was increasingly prominent in this era. I'm going to skip by the other programs because I realize I'm going quite slowly here. In the 1980s, prominent things happening in the United States. There was continued anti-communism. The war on drugs was prominent in the United States. The Reagan presidency, a conservative presidency, featured a very well-known president who was internationally promoting a form of conservatism. Cable television was on the rise, so there was programming, more controversial programming available on cable than on regular television, and this helped to redefine television. Television broadcasters actually asked for and got some more flexibility in what they showed on television because of the competition with cable. and family comedies started taking on social issues. More controversies, more cultural controversies were being shown on television at this point. Miami Vice was a very stylized television show, police show that dealt a lot with drug trafficking, sexual issues, things of that nature. Star Trek Next Generation, it was a spin-off of the original Star Trek, continued some of the approach that the original Star Trek did. Families, still very prominent on television, but dealt with sometimes in different ways. The Cosby Show was featured it was the first show, really. There had been other family shows built around black characters in the 70s, but the Cosby Show was the first show to depict a black family that was also a successful, by traditional middle class standards, a successful family. The father in the family was a doctor, and the family was upwardly mobile, kids going to college, all this sort of thing. So this was a different way of depicting black families. Next to that, Roseanne, also a comedy, family comedy, showed a white working class family, downwardly mobile, struggling economically and dealing with controversial social issues. So there's sort of a flip-flop where previously the few shows that existed about African American families showed families in difficult circumstances, and the typical white family show showed upwardly mobile. These two kind of reverse the model. 1990s, U.S. culture, there's another period of economic growth, the end of welfare. The post-Soviet era begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union, expansion of cable television, growth of satellite, and television programming in the 1990s. The Simpsons was a show that emerged in the early 1990s and has continued, actually probably late 1980s, but it became more popular in the early 1990s. That show has continued for years. I don't know if you all might be familiar with it, but and then in 2000s, the World Trade Center attack, war on terror, financial downturns, and Bush and Obama presidencies are happening. And in this era, one show that was particularly interesting was in the middle of the screen here is 24. This was a show that was used different kind of style. One season was supposed to be 24 hours in real time, and it featured an agent who was dealing with terror, family kidnappings, and things of this nature. So television kind of pushing the envelope, responding more quickly to cultural change now than previously. In previous decades, oftentimes television didn't address issues until they had been part of culture for some time. This program emerged very shortly after the September 11th attacks, and took on very, very concretely some of the issues facing the U.S. public at this time. Some of the trends in television that we should be aware of: the transition of sponsorship. So there's this transition over time from single sponsorship to spot advertising. Public broadcasting. I haven't mentioned public broadcasting, but I think a trend needs to be understood. Public broadcasting for a period was very strong in the United States, funded by primarily by government. Over time, funding has been reduced and public broadcasting has weakened with lack of government support. Broadcast now exists in competition with cable, satellite, and the internet. And broadcasters are trying to coexist and actually be part of all those environments at the same time. And niche programming, niche marketing of channels, focusing, trying to draw smaller audiences to lots of different channels is the trend now at this point. Okay, we're out of time, so I'll continue next week. I'll talk with Ken and look at what's coming up and what our schedule will be for the coming weeks, so that we catch up with the chapters that we're covering and you have an idea which chapters are coming when. I hope you all have a good week, and I believe you'll have a 10-minute break now. Ken should come back in 10 minutes. So I hope you all have a good week. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Hello, sir. Can you hear me? Hello. Sir. I will start my presentation now. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sisi from Malaysia, and today I will have a presentation about movie. And movie actually is a creation of photography, discovery of the illusion of motion by combining individual still image and study of human and animals or locomotion. And before to understand movie, we need to know what is we need to know what is motion picture, and I don't know why it's called the word. And motion picture is actually a sequence of consecutive pictures of objects photographed in motion by a specially designed camera and thrown on a screen by a projector in such rapid succession as to give the illusion of natural movement. In another word, you can see this, they have a series of pictures with slightly different action, and this picture, when they are flipped in a certain speed, they will form a motion. And first, all the words is blocked. And the kinetoscope is designed by Thomas Edison in 1891, and the films can be viewed by one individual at a time through a pinhole viewer window at the top of the device. So you can see this one is the kinetoscope, and this one through the pinhole, just one individual can see through it. Yeah. And first, because the kinetoscope is only can view by one individual, and they developed a cinematographer who is designed by the brothers August and Louis Lumiere in 1895. And this is a film projector and also is a camera and a printer. This cinematograph can be easily filming and also allow more audience to watch the movie. And I think this one is actually is a example of the cinematograph, but I think it's kind of real. And just give it. And Nickelodeon. Nickelodeon was the first type of indoor exhibition space dedicated to showing projected motion pictures. It's like a first cinema, but it's quite simple. And in United States, films established itself as a popular form of entertainment with the Nickelodeon theater in 1910. And this one is the Jazz Singer. The Jazz Singer is an American music film, and this one is the first music film that marked the birth of the talking film, and this like the silent film era. And after this kind of old movie, the films go Technicolor. Means that Technicolor is a color motion picture process invented in 1960 and then improved over several decades. However, people would continue to make films in black and white until the late 1950s. Although the Technicolor was developed, but the people will still continue the black and white film. And thus the rise and fall of the Hollywood studios. By 1950s, most of the major film studios had moved to Hollywood. During the golden age of Hollywood, these major studios controlled every aspect of the movie industry, and the films they produced drew crowds to the theater. And after World War II, the studio system declined as a result of antitrust legislation that took power away from studios. Invention of television present a threat. After the invention of television, there is a minus of audience who like to watch the movie in the theater. And third, the development of films. During the 1960s and 1970s, there was a rise in films that celebrate the immersion of youth culture and the rejection of the commercialism of the previous decades. This also led to looser attitudes towards depictions of sexuality and violence in films. And the 1990s and beyond. The adoption of the VCR by most households in the 1980s reduced audience at the movie theater, like what I stated in front, but opened a new mass market for home viewers. Improvements in computer animation led to more special effects in films during the 1990s. And after this, the relationship between movies and culture. As products of mass culture, movies reflect cultural attitudes, trends, and concerns. Movies show a certain culture, not only between different countries, but also in different times. And this was the examples. David Griffin's film, The Birth of Nation, presenting a racist perspective on the U.S. Civil War and its aftermath reflected racist content of the era in which it was produced. During World War II, films reflected the patriotic pro-war sentiments of the time. And in the 1960s and 1970s, with the rise of an anti-establishment youth culture, movies adapt more liberal stance towards sexuality and violence. And third, after the future of Vietnam War, films reflect a more ambivalent attitude towards war. And this is the important point. The MPAA rating system and has established in 1968 give filmmakers greater freedom in the content they were able to portray on screen. And this one is actually the MPAA rating system, and through this we can see before the movie are shown, there are certain ratings that allow different kind of people to watch it. And this one is the general audience. The G is for all age admitted, means that it's like everyone you can watch it. And PG was the children under the guide of parents, they can watch this movie. And PG 13, the person who reached 13 only they can watch the movie. And third, so on, the restricted and the adults only is like after you are adults of more than 17 or some countries are more than 20, only you can watch this type of movie. And third, movie and culture. Movies shape cultural attitudes and customs as audience adopt to the attitudes and styles of character they watch on screen. Different people watch different movies, maybe they have different understanding and they have different ideas about the movie. And filmmakers may use their movies to influence cultural attitudes towards certain social issues. The filmmakers they might put their own thinking and thoughts into the into the movie, and so that the audience can understand their thoughts through the movie. And issue and trends in films. A film's performance at the box office is often directly related to the studio marketing budget that backs it. Because of the high marketing and production costs, the major studios have increasingly come to rely on blockbuster films to keep themselves profitable. And the Blockbuster is an American-based provider for home movie and video game rental service through a video rental shop. You may rent a DVD or videos through the shop or by emails, and so that you can watch it yourself in home. Third issue and trends in films. Independent films found increased popularity in the 1990s and 2000s in part of because they represent a break from the particular material often released by studios. With the rise of digital film technology and the online movie piracy has become an increasing concern of Hollywood. And actually this one is the VCR, but you can't see the words again. Sorry. I'm sorry for this. Yeah. Okay, VCR is actually a video cassette recorder. It means that through this kind of tape you put into the recorder, you may record the movies and play back. Before this development, the movie you can just only watch it one time, but you can't play back. And through this development, the video or movie are recorded inside the video cassette. But in 1990s, the VCR is replaced by the DVD technology. DVD is what we use now to watch videos or play games, and it replaced the VCR in 1990s. But the development of the Blu-ray disc, it has more capacity to storing high definition and ultra high definition video resolution. Means that you can view more clear image through this Blu-ray disc, and this is replace the VCR. DVD sales and rentals account for about a third of films revenues. Some films are released straight to DVD without ever appearing in theaters. This is because the production budget of the movie to theater is more expensive than you straight away release to the DVD. And Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of Clones, was the first big budget film to be recorded digitally. And since then, many more films have been made with digital cinematography. However, a full-scale industry change has been gradual, mainly because of the cost of conversion. And third, the 3D dimensional movies were a fad in the 1950s that had been largely relegated to a niche in the motion picture industry because of the costly hardware and process required to produce and replace 3D films, and also the lack of standardized format for all segments of the entertainment business. The 3D was actually developed in 1950, but because of the cost of production and also the lack of facility in different cinemas, it is not really popular. And I think most of you have watched this. Avatar is a 3D film, and these 3D films are actually shown in almost in 2010. And between the 2010 and 1950, there was almost 50 years that actually 3D films was not popular. And I have 3 questions about the movies, but I think the answer was shown. And the first question is, the movie is not combination of discovery of art and innovation. As I mentioned in front, movie is actually a creation of photograph, study of human and animal locomotion, and discovery of the illusion of motion. And the second question is, which system gave filmmakers greater freedom in the content they were able to portray on screen? The answer is MPAA, is C. Through the MPAA rating system, because they have different rating system, the filmmakers they have more freedom to make the movie without any limits. And lastly, the third question, why did the 3D movies turn out in the 1950s? And the answer is C. The answer is A. The costly hardware and the process required to produce and display a 3D film, and also the lack of a standardized format for all segments of the entertainment business. And this is my end of presentation, and I'm sorry about if I doing not well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll, if Viola can upload her PowerPoint, then we'll proceed with the presentation on television, and then I'll have a few comments after that.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My Chinese name is Wu Jing, but I thought my English name is Will, so you can call me Will. So today I am going to talking about the television. I prepared four part of the presentation, and first, I'm sorry. Oh, I don't know, but we have some questions. Okay, first one we are talking about the evolution of the television. The origins of the television, sorry. Okay. 2K's technological developments in the late 2000s played a vital role in the. I'm sorry. Two K technological development in the late 1800s played a vital role in the evolution of the television. The cassette ray tape and the scanning disc. The cassette ray railroad, invited by the German scientist Carl Braun in the 1897, was for any of the television picture tube. It had the fluorescent skins and electing visible light in the front of images when struck by a beam of the electrons. The skin disk invented by the German inventor Paul Crow was a large float metal disc and could be used as a rotating camera. It serves as the foundation of the experience as a transmission of the vision image of the several decades and more conventional television versus electric television. Out of the cathode ray tube and the screen desk, two types of the current television system involved. Mechanical system and electric system. Mechanical television system had the servo teleco disadvantages. Now, resolution counts filled images and the use of the spinning disc, named as the number of new pictures that could be seen per second, result in the excessive flagging by 1939, or the mechanical television broadcast in the United States has been replaced by the electric broadcast. That is about the early broadcasting. Early television was expensive and the technology was slow to catch on because development was delayed during World War II. Color technology was delayed even further because early color system was incompatible and with black and white television sets. Following the war, the television light replaced the radio as the new mass medium. During the golden age of the television in the 1950s, television moved away from the radio formats and developed a new type of the shows, including the magazine style with reality shows and television spectrum. Since 1960, several key technological developments have taken place in the television industry. Color television gained popularity in the late 1960s and began to replace black and white television in the 1970s. Cable television actually developed in the 1940s to the cable and to the river and in the real era. Switched to it focused from local to national television, offering an extensive number of the channels. In the 2009, the traditional remote system, which has been in place for 16 years, was replaced with a digital television, giving viewers and higher quality picture and fading up a frequency space. As for 2010, near half of American viewers have high definition television, which offers have a crystal clear picture in the way the skin to promote a similar appearance at home. Okay, the second part is about issue and trends in the television industry. During the 1950s, the cost of the production a single television show increased as the show became longer and the production cost soared. Sponsorship on the network television shifted from the single sponsorship in which a program was entirely supported and produced by one advertiser to multiple sponsorship in which advertisers bought 1 or 2 minute spots on the show. Also, one advertiser controlled and content of the show. Sponsors had something in the program's subject matter. Sponsors have retained some control of the program content by the withdrawing funding from the show that demanded to have offense in apprehending content of the public television and corporate sponsorship. Public television was created and also to provide a television service for people in real era or those who could not have afford to pay for a private television service. Despite its offerings or as a no community, public television has increasingly has to turn to criminal sponsorship to stay alive. Government government funding for public television has declined over the year, and competition from the live cable channels has reduced in the future increasing. Okay, let's work. Between 1950s and the 1970s, the big three networks ABC, CBS, and NBC account for around 95% of the part-time viewing. The addition of the Fox in the 1986 created in the Big Four, however, attempt to create an additional major network have been unsuccessful. CBS opened UPN and the Time Warner opened WB, merging in the 2006 to created the CW. Trained at the woman age 18 to 34, the CW consistently ranks a low face in the rating. The primary change to network television has been the reported growth of the cable, which grows especially in the 1980s and the 1990s as a result of the industry correlation and the use of the satellite to describe a local channel to a national audience product by the HO in the 1970s. Cable broadcaster use a process known as the line casting to target large apparently from their shows. China usually focus on the single topic such as news, weather, shopping, or comedy. Competition from the cable has focused network. Television to loosen its restriction regarding sex and violence on the shows, and the network has turned increasing to the now increasing to the now casting in the era to the return. Do you think this after is erode computation from the cable and other success close has caused part-time review and evidence of the Big Four network to drop from 43% in the 1994 to 23% in 2009. Okay, the third part is about the influence of the new technology. Uh, the first the first styling television single was broadcast in 1962. However, the television induction did not begin until the standard of the broadcasting proposed until the late 1970s. Early programs with the satellite television include the high cost of the satellite dish and the serve of the satellite signals. Following the passing of the Cable Act in 1984, once currency was under control, satellite television company began to emerging and become too profitable. The two biggest correct satellite television provider are DirecTV and which target is the service toward affluent customers, and Dish Network, which targets the lower earning customers. Since the 1999 legislation enabled slighted company to the basket local China, satellite television has become a global threat to cable. Satellite company attempted to lure crowd customer by the offer premium channel sports and movie product and the complete pictures. The impact of the DVRs and the internet. Unlike some other form of the media, television is so far solving the impact of the internet. However, the World Wide Web is changing content developing minds and the way people conserve television and program uh, schedule now viewing outlets such as YouTube and Hulu enable viewers to watch online video clips independently of the television shows and the movie free of the change. Also, the Hulu has may soon offer paid content to offset of the losses in the network advertising review. Video on demand service now available through most cable and satellite provider along videos to older movies or television programs at their convenience rather than having to adhere to fixed program schedule. VOD is also available through internet sites such as Amazon.com and Netflix, allowing people to stream shows and video clips to their smartphones and watching television where on the go. Thanks to the influence of the internet, the television is becoming more interactive, uh, which projector combining a segment of the traditional video and online content. This is manifest in two ways now. New feature that the provider reveals with a hundred of the additional opinions will they watch their favorite shows. For example, the ability to look up a news story or get a weather update. And social television, which encourages viewers to combine television videos with a social network, for example, by blogging or joining on the online chat about the show. Okay, I prefer the three questions, and one is 2K. The technological developments in the late 1900s played a vital role in the evolution of the television. The answer is A. The the cathode ray tube and the scanning disk. These two technological developments in the 19,000s so played a vital role in the evolution of the television. The question two is the primary challenge on the network television has been the reported growth of the cable, which grew exponentially in the 1980s and 1990s as a result of industrial regulation and the use of the satellites to describe local channel to the national audience. The answer is C. HBO in the 1970s. The third question is the first satellite television single was broadcast in 1962. Thank you for your listening.
Okay, thank you. I'm uploading an updated version of my last update. So this is an update on television that updates the update that I shared with you last week. Gathered some new information. There we are. Okay, so let me find that here real quick. Oops. Okay. Okay, so thank you for the presentations. Before I start my presentation, let me just kind of update us. I'm trying to remember. I think Frederick skipped one chapter, if I remember right, and I believe that was that he skip movies? I don't remember now what he skipped, but it seemed like he skipped one chapter. So I'm not exactly sure what he's going to be presenting next week. But let's go ahead with our presentations as we've scheduled them. It doesn't really matter too much whether he presents first or you present first. It comes out the same. Either you help people, help your classmates to understand the subject a little bit before Frederick speaks, or you help after he speaks. So not much difference. So we'll proceed with the student presentations as they're scheduled, unless there's a conflict or something on your end. But I think, and I see we have for Frederick, he's scheduled next week to talk about both electronic games and the internet, which are two chapters he can put together fairly easily. They're quite, even though electronic games began before, well, I don't know, before the internet, but before the World Wide Web, we'll say that. The internet began very early as a military project. And so about the same time that PCs, that personal computers started coming out, and I know back in the late 1960s, probably more than the early 1970s, some of my relatives had PCs already and were playing some of the initial fairly simple games that existed in those days, like Pong, people like that, stuff like that. So that was about the time that the internet was initially created. But the World Wide Web, as we know it now, is creation more of about the 1990s, and so and certainly gaming has blended into the online to the World Wide Web now more than ever. So those two subjects can be taught by Frederick on the same time. Whether he does that next week or whether it's the week after, if he's catching up with one that he skipped, then it may be the week after. I'm still trying to figure out, or trying to remember what he did. But I know we're a week behind someplace that he's going to have to catch up. We're already scheduled for him to cover two subjects on May 27th also with ethics and media and government. So once again, we may be, maybe he'll double up when on the week we have economics and mass media, add another subject to that. But we'll figure that out. One thing just to mention for the students as you're doing your presentations, your audience, so to speak, is your webcam. And one of the things I try to emphasize in my critique sheet is whether you're keeping what we might call eye contact. Now, sometimes when I'm looking at my own, actually I have my webcam right above my video here. So when I'm looking at myself on the video, I'm almost looking at the webcam. And I'm trying not to read my notes too much as we proceed, and so I can look at the webcam. So that gives when we record this, as you know, we're recording this for posterity. You're going to watch this forever and ever. The people viewing it, it'll make a difference to them if they're watching. If it seems like you're making eye contact with them, even though it's through the internet. And it does with me when I'm listening to you live. When you're reading your notes like this or something, that kind of distracting. I'm seeing the top of your head or something mostly. So try to maintain some eye contact with the camera as best you can. I know some of you are struggling and with your English, you're having to read more than I would, obviously. So anyway, do what you can. Just one thought I thought I'd share with you before I proceeded with my presentation. We talked about this last week. Like I said, the first few slides on this PowerPoint we already talked about. So I'm going to skip down and try to find where I left off. Okay, I think we'll start right there. So we talked last week about how broadcasting seems to be reaching a tipping point. I turn off my drawing tools, and so this was one of the illustrations of what a tipping point might look like that I used before. And so, as in the same way that newspapers hit their tipping point about 10 years ago, my belief is that we're hitting a tipping point right now with broadcast TV and cable TV, not just broadcast TV. You might say traditional TV, paid broadcast TV, satellite TV, and cable are all hitting a tipping point as more and more people move to the internet. So I wanted to share a few more slides with you than what I shared last week. Now this one I actually did include last week, but just to remind you, this was a survey done last summer, almost exactly, just a little less than 1 year ago, or a little less than 1 year ago. How likely are you to cancel your pay TV? That means cable, satellite TV, so forth. Not referring to internet TV, but paid offline TV, if you would. And it was, as you recall, in the area of extremely, very, and moderately likely, we have over 21% of the people that seem fairly likely to cancel their pay TV. We had another 20%, almost, that were slightly, and the way these things start, as I mentioned last week, they kind of snowball. As some people do it, they talk to their relatives consider it, they start doing it. So these things can snowball rather quickly. So it would not be a bit surprising to me if we saw a 40% decline on cable TV or pay TV, by early this year, or at least mid-year. Let me put it that way. So about a year from after this was done. So here's a new one. Now this one is showing the decline. This was as of 2014. So this is still a little bit old. This is older than the previous data you saw. But even at that, you see some fairly drastic declines on TV. And again, this looks like it's including both broadcast and cable TV, pay TV, but basically offline TV, if you want to call it that. And so we see even in this one, and let me bring down the control panel a little bit so we can see the bottom. So this first one, we're seeing these in order. So 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. So we see a very steady decline of TV in America. This is in America, but again, the world kind of, the trend begins in America typically and then spreads worldwide in most things. So TV is definitely moving down rather quickly, and this was before the last survey that I showed you. So this could, as I say, kind of with a tipping point, you see suddenly an increase, a rapid increase of something. And so this was a fairly gradual decrease, and the increased decline, if you would, so the increased decrease, if you would, will look like it's picking up steam here. And again, according to that survey we just looked at, could drop rather dramatically in 2015 and now in 2016. We saw similar declines in radio. Print is even more massive declines. Online, we see there's even some, they're considering online, you see there's contrasting online versus mobile. So to them, online would be your PC, and I think they typically include with PC, from the data I've been viewing over the last year or so, when they say online, they're including desktop and laptop. So when they say mobile, they're not including laptops, although a laptop is very mobile. They're not including that. They're including PCs and laptops together as online, and then mobile would be your smart pad and your smartphone. So you see the very dramatic increase, and again, this is just as 2014, a very dramatic increase in the use of mobile, and a kind of corresponding decline in 2013 and 14 of the use of PCs, both again desktop and mobile, and laptop. So we're seeing some interesting trends, but by far the biggest upward trend is the use of mobile, as you see here, skyrocketing. And that is not expected to change. That trend line is expected to keep going basically until the rest of these disappear. That's what I would say, is that mobile will continue increasing until almost everything else, maybe not online for a while, but until TV disappears, radio disappears, print disappears. You'll see this upward trend with mobile until they disappear, and then it'll flatten out and level out, so to speak. So those are fairly definitive numbers. My next slide here, again, this is, again, older data actually, but just kind of seeing from a different perspective. This was Q1 of 2010, Q2 of 2010, that's with the zero, or the Q1, 10, so this first quarter, 2010, and then this third quarter of 2013. So again, you see a very steady decline in cable by this chart as well. It's actually older data than what we've already looked at, so I'll go ahead and skip forward, but I just wanted to kind of reemphasize, this is not, in this case, this is I wouldn't call this exactly a tipping point, because this is a steady decline, so it's not a real tip. This year, I think 2015, what we were seeing with the data from last June represents a real tipping point where this is going to start collapsing, as in 2005 for newspapers, or 2006, 7, in that period of time. I went ahead and put all the text here. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. So Nielsen's, which measures TV viewing in America and many other countries, most recent study indicates that Americans aged 18 to 24 watched a weekly average of almost 16.5 hours of traditional TV during the second quarter of 2015. So they're still watching a lot of TV, but that represents a year-over-year decline of 2 hours and 35 minutes. So the previous year, in 2014, they were watching basically 19 hours of TV. So you see this again is they're still watching a lot of TV, but the trend line is moving very quickly towards less and less TV. I see we're out of time here, aren't we? Well, let me go over this real quickly, and I'll ship this to you. But you see, I'm going to drop down the bottom, a 32% drop off in viewing between 2011 and 2015. So in the space of 4 years, almost 1/3 of this age group's traditional TV viewing time has migrated to other activities. Real quickly to a couple more slides here. At the same time, while they're watching less TV, they're also doing other things at the same. Okay, no, that's not what this one is about. Viewing TV online, so to speak. No, that isn't. Okay, this is what they're doing while they're watching TV. So we're seeing multitasking while people are watching TV. This is an increased trend also. So while they're not necessarily turning off the TV, they're doing all this sort of stuff at the same time. They're surfing the web at the same time. They're shopping while they're doing it. They're checking sports scores. They're basically using, in most cases, their mobile devices. The green is smartphone. the blue is the smart tablet, and they're doing all this sort of stuff at the same time. The question I'm going to put on Facebook is whether you're doing this stuff. I want to know whether you're doing the same sort of stuff as you're watching TV. And similarly, okay, this one is also about multitasking, so it's just kind of a replication of that same same trend. So again, I want to know what you're doing in relation to multitasking during TV time. Here is the reason why a lot of people prefer to watch TV on the internet. So whether it's Hulu or Netflix or YouTube or any of the online TV type services, video services, why do they do it? Prefer to watch on their own schedule. It's more convenient. You can read all these yourself, and I will send this to you. And this, of course, will also be, I'll be uploading the video today also, so you can look at this in more detail when I do that. And again, we're about ending it here, or was that it? Okay, so that was the last one. So people are moving online very quickly. I see a tipping point occurring here that we can't ignore, I don't think. So anyway, that's my further update of what's happening on TV. I will, if anybody has any questions, want to linger, that's fine. Otherwise, I see, some people, you need to go to your other classes and so forth. So thank you for spending this time with us this week. Next week, then we have presentations. Again, let's see, Viola again presents next week, and Dayun also presents next week with the electronic games and with the internet and social media. So have a good week. The week after that is when your next creative project is due. So it's 2 weeks from today, your next creative project is due. So hopefully, if you have any questions on that, need any help with that, let me know. Okay, so thank you. Have a good week, and we will see you next Wednesday.